Hello, everybody. Thanks again for joining us on the second part of our Future of HGV debate. In this part, we're going to discuss the infrastructure required for options both by the country and the individual companies utilising the option. And then we're going to look at whether the infrastructure and capability is there for rapid deployment should one option get picked reasonably quickly. So we talked about a number of different options, and obviously the two ones we talked about in the main, I think, were both electric and hydrogen. Darren, if say, the battery picked up and you wanted to, deploy electric vehicles around, what sort of infrastructure, how would the challenge be? Would both from purchasing vehicles and then the infrastructure you'd need yourself, and also then what other support you'd need from the country?
Yeah, so purely speaking, from a sort of operational consumer of product and infrastructure, I think it's one of those moot points where we talk about the capital cost of the vehicles themselves, and we brought our first 67 vehicles in purchased outright, but behind the scenes, it's the infrastructure costs in the enabling part of that, in particular deployment of chargers. Now, from when we started 3 years ago, I think it's fair to say, Sam, sort of the hardware piece is probably reduced by 50% to where I was paying sort of £7,000 for a dual 11 kilowatt charger. I think they're probably around the £2,000 mark. So charge points themselves have come down considerably. I think that's because there's a lot more businesses out there vying for that opportunity. So in regards to the costs for the capital purchase or even the leasing costs for the vehicles, that's one part. But then the issues what we had over our Heathrow depot and installation was the inbound power supply into the depots themselves, particularly when you're in a heavy sort of industrialized area where there's a lot of draw from businesses. I think that was one of the key constraints what determined us going for a lesser charger. The fact that it was significantly cheaper in terms of the actual charge point. It's aspirationally, we would like 24 50 watt kilowatt chargers deployed, but for the numbers we need, we didn't have the inbound supply into the warehousing where we was keeping our vehicles. So it was very much a considered debate that we had. Do we go for a cheaper charge with a lesser draw? But that in itself, having a lesser charging rate, therefore increases your charge time. So that operationally was a little bit of a constraint, and that was born from really the cost at the time of the significantly higher charge points, and the inbound power supply was a huge factor in going for a lesser charger, and that pretty much meant 10 to 12 hours of overnight charging before the vehicles were operational to deploy in the morning. So huge considerations, whether it's price, but particularly the big constraint for us at the time was around the inbound power supply. It just wasn't there in the locations where we needed it initially.
Okay, thank you. And Sam, you'd probably be more attuned to this than certainly I would be. So if you was painting the picture for that challenge that Darren talked about, is that something that you feel the government are very much aware of and doing stuff for, or will it be as the market grows, then the supply will grow?
Yeah, well, as far as government awareness is concerned, I think they're more receptive to the needs in the more public domain in terms of helping to try and get the power where it needs to be, and the relevant grid reinforcements for the serious power that we need in the public domain. Darren's example is a good one, and there's many haulage companies or logistics companies with that exact challenge. I'm in a fortunate position, I suppose, in working with 10 or 15 different hauliers at the moment through this funded project, which means I get to see all the different landscapes. So painting the picture, to use your words, my landscape's pretty wide. So we can see that there's certain people that are quite happy with a 22 or a 43 kilowatt AC charger on the wall, and they've got a long dwell time, and that's fine. But similarly, in the same project with the same truck, we've got people that are wanting a megawatt, so that's 1,000 kilowatts, and be able to charge in 20-30 minutes during a taco break on the motorway, and everything in between. So there is no one size fits all for technology, and there's no one size fits all for the industry either. So again, I go back to the lowest hanging fruit point, but there's probably a solution somewhere for everybody. but certainly on the higher power stuff, it increases the cost dramatically. So to get the right grid reinforcements, the right power into some of these places is astronomically expensive. And in fact, I used to work with DX a long time ago, and one of the sites down in southeast London, we were looking to put some Mercedes vans in a long time ago, and we discovered that the amount of power required to put 5 Mercedes eVitos in was we needed all the capacity of the entire industrial estate at the time, let alone that singular unit. So that didn't work. But like Darren said, time's moved on, right? And we're forever finding creative ways of trying to mitigate that. And some of it might be that the solution isn't necessarily from the grid. It might be that there's battery storage and solar on the roof that enables a trickle charge of a battery that then is discharged when you need it and trickle charges the rest of the time. So there's all sorts of different types of technology that we can look at to try and solve this challenge. And again, as Darren said, with economies of scale, prices are coming down, cost of solar panels are coming down, battery cost is coming down. So we're making progress in that regard as far as the economics is concerned.
I think that's a good makes, David, particularly around sort of that usage of photovoltaic. We're going through that in our warehousing, some of our sites, but equally I deployed photovoltaic panels on some of our maxi-low 4D transits as well, which could make the difference of getting home or not in some cases on the road. But we're not blessed with the best of climates for sort of photovoltaic panels everywhere, but we could hope. But no, I think it's blended. I do see the cost of the hardware, the charge points themselves coming down significantly. Whether that's because of competition, Sam, you would know better than I, in the marketplace, and just production and manufacturing scaled up. But for me, the big thing, and Sam's raised it as well, is just the inbound supply, particularly when you're in industrialized areas whereby everybody wants to draw on that same available power generation. But so it's an interesting point. It's sort of multifaceted, but it's one that we can overcome. But I do think it needs government to awaken to this and sort of understand. And I know Sam will be lobbying as well as other organisations out there to government in terms of this funding. It needs mass adoption, and that needs mass power generation. And that's only going to come from major UK PLC investment, and whether that's sort of under PFI initiatives could help, but certainly mass funding's needed to the grid, I think, personally. Okay,
that's very interesting. And you're talking about you've got the ability to fast charge or slower charge. And I'm not aware of this. Is the cost of electricity based upon how much you use? So if you fast charge it, you pay the same amount, but you just pay it a bigger amount in quicker time, or is that how the cost of electricity works for charging?
It's very, very varied. So if you're in a depot environment, then or off the public domain, then you're probably if you're a larger company, you're probably hedging your bets on that one. You're probably hedging your electricity and buying it in advance up front, which is the best way of keeping the prices down. And then you've got a unit rate that and you can stick to for a period of time. So like at home and in depots or in offices, the cheapest place to charge will always be at home or on site. We've got an awful lot of infrastructure in the public domain that needs to be accounted for in our pricing. So public charging is inherently more expensive, and it's too expensive at the moment. So we need government help to try and bring that down, to try and improve our ability to get the prices where they need to be to make it more competitive in the public domain. So there is quite a price disparity at the moment between charging on site versus charging in the public areas. So it can change quite dramatically as a result of that.
With your EV mindset there, Sam, would you like that, the government to subsidise some of that for a period to help the transition, to take some of the pain out of it for people?
Yeah, any subsidies would be welcome, I think, to business. Particularly where the price point at the moment remains quite high in terms of capital purchase on equipment and infrastructure. So any offsetting by grants, etc., or levies or discounted taxation elsewhere will certainly be welcome until we get price parity, whether that comes about on traditional ICE engined trucks and vehicles. I don't know that parity exists. I think mass adoption upscaling the supply chain possibly may get us there. I can't see that anytime soon. My fear is these dates we've got embedded in our brains of 2030, 2035, like the 2025 one on cars pushed back. I don't see, unless we get some continuity in governmental thinking and some real measures and support in place. I just see those timelines getting shifted back once again. We need to do something meaningful and relatively quickly, and that's going to require significant investment.
Okay, no, it's very interesting. It's a challenging scenario, isn't it? And if hydrogen was decided to be, the option, the supply and infrastructure of that would be exactly the same issues. Whether it's the right option or not is another matter. But you'd have exactly the same challenges, wouldn't you? As much, if not more so, I think. Would that be the fair comment, Darren?
Yeah, I think for Sam alluded to it earlier. I think when you think back to the whole supply chain in terms of development of hydrogen, you've got to look at the energy costs, and particularly that's got to come from fossil fuels to generate in a lot of cases to develop this hydrogen fuel. I think the scarcity of infrastructure is constraining people's thinking and adoption, and equally the cost of vehicles themselves is significantly higher than the traditional ICE. So I think hydrogen could have a future, but again, the reality is we ball back to infrastructure challenges and cost. One of the key advantages is just like filling your road tank up with diesel. In terms of that charge time, that is one key feature. But again, I just don't see mass adoption currently, certainly not in the next 5-10 years, albeit I think it could, with the right backing and investment, be a credible alternative to solid state and BEV vehicles, certainly for trunking operations and sort of heavy goods vehicle operations, which are not operating in the traditional sort of circumference of 50 miles in the ultra-urban environment. But I don't see it becoming mainstream. I think, like all things, utopia, I think will end up being a blended approach, using fuels, using battery electric, using potentially hydrogen or CNG. So I don't think there's a one size fits all. I would suggest that the battery powered vehicles is probably the future. I think that's what we'll see most mass adoption in that sector. But I still think at the moment it's a blended solution using all manner of alternative fuels and different powertrains to get us to where we want to be. Ultimately, will zero emissions ever exist? I kind of would hope so, but I think we're a long, long way, certainly in commercial vehicle operations, from being carbon neutral, and zero emissions coming from any vehicle at the moment, certainly within the next 10 to 15 years would be my prediction.
Yeah, be a hybrid solution with a mix of, hydrogen for the big vehicles, electrics for the smaller vehicles. So, yeah, we'll have to watch that. And if one of the options was chosen straight away, how quickly do you think the deployment could happen? With government gets behind it, because we probably, like you're talking, Darren, 10 or 15 years. Do you think that is a practical term for serious change, maybe 10 years for everything to change?
Yeah, I think so. I guess you've got to look to manufacturers, and it's the technological advances what really going to drive and expedite mass adoption. I mean, if solid state rolls out and it exceeds expectations at this point, there's no reason, if the manufacturers come on board and we get that price point, it could be expedited forward and we could see mass adoption. But it's at the moment, I don't believe we're close to mass adoption on solid state batteries that are going to fulfill all commercial vehicle operations at this point. There's an absolute space at the moment. I know I've got a good friend of mine at AF Blackmore, Sam, you mentioned, you probably know Andy yourself.
Andy
so stuff, yeah, particularly around the SPA contracts, I think he's operating that. So it can work. But for me, and particularly DX operation, where we've got that long stem mileage routing, nationally, it's not there yet. And I urge people to get on and make a commitment and pledge to try and get to where we need to be quicker. I just think it needs a lot more governmental appetite, focus and commitment in terms of investment, and certainly see some of these startups getting on board. And I would like to see the rapid deployment of solid state battery, because I do think that will certainly support long-legged HGV routing across the UK.
Good. And obviously the depreciation of electric vehicles is obviously a challenge for any company purchasing them, looking for a return on investment, and that is an issue. Do you think as the technology improves, hopefully that maybe the actual initial cost will reduce and therefore the depreciation will reduce as well? Do you think that's a practical solution, maybe, Sam?
I think yes. There's a lot of factors that are involved there. The capital cost of the vehicles is high, yes, but as Andy Wilmot from AF Blakemore is a good example of someone able to demonstrate the total cost of ownership actually is working, albeit that the vehicles are grant funded at the moment. So there's different ways in which you can finance these vehicles to make sure that they are running in a cost-effective and commercial way on certain routes. Not everywhere, but it's coming along. As far as depreciation is concerned, there are different models for that too. I mean, one of the partners within my consortium is Hitachi, and they're doing a lot of work on battery as a service. So they're actually leasing the vehicle separate to the battery and treating those two things as separate assets effectively. And the benefit of doing that is that you can repurpose the asset of the battery after 10 or 15 years for another purpose, put a new set of batteries into a vehicle and keep the vehicle going, because the wear and tear of the vehicle are significantly less, far less moving parts, etc. So the longevity of the vehicle may well be able to go significantly further than the traditional diesel vehicle. And maybe it does have a battery replacement in 10 or 15 years, but that battery doesn't go in the bin. It becomes battery storage on site. That could be a battery storage for 20 years after it's been on the road for 10 or 15. And then after that, it's broken down, recycled and made into new batteries again. So there's lots of ways in which we can mitigate some of this stuff so that the depreciation and asset values can be stronger, because they'll have repurposing capabilities, etc. So we've got to look at it differently, because obviously it's a replacement for a fuel tank. But in other ways, it's a completely different asset which can be utilized in completely different ways going forward. And we've got to work out ways of thinking outside the box with all of this stuff, because I think Darren will probably testify to this. I certainly did in my experience. There is no like-for-like swap here. It's not a case of taking a diesel and comparing it to an electric or any other propulsion. It's about looking at all of the routes and going, well, how do we dice this up differently, still achieve the efficiency we need, but make this technology work for us? So I think it's important that people recognize that adaptability needs to be in the head as well. It's not just one for one. It's what do these 20 routes look like versus these 20 zero emission routes, and how do we change things to make it effective? So it's definitely some creativity required, but that creativity becomes standard and then just becomes the norm, is my experience.
I think that's a really good Sam makes in terms of that repurposing. So when you're looking at reverse supply chain and that repurposing, I think that's key. I think we're coming for a lot of people now coming to that end of that first lease cycle. There is a huge amount of nervousness around RV values. Certainly as a business DX, we've fallen foul of significantly reduced RV values, which is leading leasing companies to perhaps guard against that. So leasing prices are going up to mitigate the risk of a significantly lower RV. But we've got a blended model. So we leased sort of 40% and we outright purchased. And the capital price 3 years ago on an EV van to what it's worth now, it's just extreme. And we're carrying about £20,000 liability on a flatline depreciation model on these vans that are coming into the year 4. So that has been a bit of a wake-up call for us in terms of where we go. So we'll now probably pass on the risk, dare I say it, to the leasing companies and hope that they set the RVs accordingly, because the pace of change, particularly when solid state, we've almost gone from VHS to Blu-ray. Now we're on to kind of that DVD scenario now, where nobody's going to start buying VHS or Blu-ray because it's a technology that is almost redundant, certainly on those generation 1 type vehicles. And that's kind of where we've had to consider our purchasing options going forward. But certainly on the owned vehicle assets we've got a huge liability in the gulf between the RV and what we've got left on balance sheet in terms of depreciation. So it's a liability we would look to mitigate going forward in the way we fund the vehicles.
No, it's good. That's good. And it's complex situation, isn't it? It's not a simple A or B. It's a complex thing, and there's the transition as we go through. And can I ask you both a question as we go through the sort of green transition? And we're covering this in point 3 as we talk about, the infrastructure, etc. Do you think there should be almost a cost that's passed down to the end consumer for the transition? Because I think there is, when you talk to everyone, there is a cost to change for the greater good for everyone. Do you think there should be some sort of, green levy that maybe gets passed on to the consumers that, because of the change from whether it goes to hydrogen to, EV, whatever it goes to, there's definitely appears to be a short-term cost. Do you think there should be some sort of levy that maybe is borne or makes the transition easier for all the users of the services that should be borne by the ultimate consumer? What's your thoughts on that?
So we had to introduce a fuel levy. We've got an escalator involved in how we price our parcels and our freight, which unfortunately we've got to pass on. There's so much volatility, I think, particularly in traditional fossil fuels. We've seen that, but we've also seen that significant uptick in demand for electricity, whether it's retail, at home, or just for the purpose of vehicle charging. So yes, you're absolutely right, David, that should come into play. I mean, we're getting approached by a lot of customers who are very keen to exploit what we're doing in that ESG piece around, are we sort of carbon neutral? Everybody wants to claim it, but equally, I think it's fair to say not everyone wants to pay for it. And again, going back to that single digit margin business, whereby you just haven't got that ability to sustain and absorb costs of alternative vehicles, and whether power generations come from traditional fossil fuels, hydrogen, etc. Everything costs money. And is there an appetite for the end user? It's a very, and Sam will testify to this, it's a very intensive marketplace. There's a lot of people operating to make their networks optimal at this point, moving into different sort of areas where traditionally they want just to optimize their own networks. So it's almost a race to the bottom in some cases with a lot of parcel and freight carriers. It's a hugely competitive space at the moment. And to offer something like that, when you've got other business who are equally facing their own challenges around cost outside of the logistics industry, want to keep their costs, is there an appetite for those to pay? I would argue yes in some cases, but equally it's a nice to wave that green banner for those who are on receipt of green supply chains, but equally there's less of an appetite, I believe, in wanting to pay for that or sharing the pain of their logistics providers to support that.
Yeah, and Sam, because I'll get your thoughts on that, but also if you think from the government's perspective and the chancellors, the change of the way we pay a lot of tax through diesel and petrol, that financial model is changing. So they'll be got to be thinking of some way of replacing that income, want a better word. Must be a challenge for them as well. So what are your thoughts, both almost from a government's perspective and a user like myself and Darren would be if we were getting stuff delivered to home? What's your thoughts?
Well, I think you've touched on levies, green levies generally. I guess you can put them into two buckets, can you? You Darren, and you've already mentioned it, David, in regards to the market force levies in terms of needing to pass that cost on to the end consumer, and then there's government levies that can be introduced that covers all the whole market in terms of trying to encourage this uptake. And like all the things we've discussed today, I think it's a tapered approach where you need different methodologies to try and encourage the uptake of this solution whilst not impeding or impinging on anyone's ability to trade and still keep a competitive market. As far as the government concerned, we might have a pence per mile freight tax maybe at some point in the future or if we can find a way of tracking that in effective ways. I'm still not sure how that could be done in practice. We could have carbon link levies. There could be a tiered approach where small businesses have a different impact than large ones in terms of their needs to meet certain emission targets. So there's all sorts of ways that we could dice this up. I think it's important that there is carrots and sticks in this in both ways, and that we make sure that we don't do anything too aggressive. I think history has taught me in the EV world that There's been lots of plug-in van grants and congestion charge exemptions, etc. But they need to end eventually. It has to stop. That can't be there forever. The taxes still need to be paid. So there needs to be a tapered approach to all of this stuff that enables encouragement of the market, but similarly nothing too severe, and not to turn it off really quickly either. It's got to be a tapered approach to get us into the place we need to be from a sustainability angle.
Great. Okay, good. So look, thanks guys. I think that sort of finishes off us for the second part of our debate. And in the final stage, we'll be talking about some things we talked about there in more detail, really, where will the market be able to develop by itself, or will the government need to drive it? So, but we'll discuss that in part 3.